Hello everyone, and welcome to this final session of our conference. My name is Yeandle and I'm Professor of Sociology at the University of Sheffield, where I lead the Sustainable Care Connecting People and Systems programme, which is the organiser of this conference. We've asked three panellists to share their thoughts on sustainable care as we close this online conference, which we've been holding now over the last 3 weeks, and which replaces the conference we'd hoped to run last April live in Sheffield as a real event before we were forced to postpone those plans by the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our conference is called Care, Challenges and Solutions for a Sustainable Future. So the topics that we've chosen for this final panel helps us to focus on what we may go away and think about and do and study and write about in the future. Our first speaker will offer a reflection, our second a warning, and our third a vision. Each will speak for about 10 minutes and there will be time for them to respond to your comments and questions before I formally close the conference. So can I please encourage you to write your thoughts, comments and questions that you would like the panel to respond to or to think about after they have given their speeches. I'm going to introduce our three speakers before any of them speaks, so that I don't have to interrupt the flow of your thinking about what they have to say during this session. I'm delighted to begin by introducing Professor Judith Phillips, OBE, who will be our first panellist and will speak first on a reflection. Judith is Deputy Principal for Research and Professor of Gerontology at the University of Stirling in Scotland. And she is the UK Research Institute's, the UK Research and Innovation Research Director for the Healthy Ageing Challenge, which is a really important programme of research that's been developed in the UK for those of you who are joining us from elsewhere. Judith's research interests are in the social, behavioural and environmental aspects of ageing, and you will be familiar, most of you, with much of her work. She was previously Director of the Research Institute for Applied Social Sciences at Swansea University in Wales, and she was also Director of the Centre for Ageing and Dementia Research for Wales while she was there. Judith has been very active in shaping the gerontological research landscape in the UK, and her research has had a significant influence on government policy. She is a former president of the British Society of Gerontology and was awarded her OBE for services to older people in 2013. Our second speaker will also be well known to you, Professor Mary Daly from the University of Oxford. Mary is Professor of Sociology and Social Policy in the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at Oxford, and she is a Fellow of Green Templeton College at Oxford, where she also leads a very successful and notable regular seminar series relating to care. Mary's latest book is Gender Inequality and Welfare States in Europe, which was published last year by Edward Elgar, and she has previously published books on welfare and the Great Recession and on families and poverty, a study of everyday life on a low income. She also gave us almost 2 decades ago a very important and influential book, Gender and the Welfare State, which most of you will know. Our third and final contributor is our very own, as we like to think of her, Karla Zimpel-Leal. Karla is Senior Lecturer in Innovation and Enterprise at Oxford Brookes Business School, a position which she has recently taken up, and we congratulate her on that. Karla has her PhD from the University of East Anglia, and she held a prestigious UKRI Innovation Fellowship linked to the Sustainable Care Programme between 2018 and the end of 2020 on advancing business innovation and skills development in the home care sector. So we have three great speakers to stimulate our thinking on a Friday afternoon, and I therefore have great pleasure in inviting Judith to take the floor and make her opening comments. Judith, welcome.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you for your very kind words and for a great conference. It's been super. I'm going to look at what is sustainable care, reflecting back through 4 different lenses. First of all, personal and professional lens. Now, the last year has given us opportunity to reflect back, hasn't it? And I think it's an appropriate time to take stock of social care. Social care has had visibility over the last year, probably for the wrong reasons. The false promise of a quick fix on the steps of Downing Street, human stories of separation and loneliness, and sadly, death of residents in care homes. So a conference looking at sustainability of care couldn't be more timely. And we've probably all had the opportunity to reflect back over the last year to make sense of what we're experiencing. I think it's also important, though, to look back at our research through a personal and professional lens to actually understand sustainable care. I think reflexivity is essential in the way in which we reflect and also define sustainable social care. So I'm going to draw on both personal and professional lenses as I illustrate my understanding of sustainable care. So I started as a care worker in residential care, and I qualified as a social worker with adults working in a very deprived area. And so I would bring very different personal experiences, ideas, and research questions to what is sustainable, very different from somebody who perhaps is a carer. This, alongside the fact that I'm actually aging, is the lens through which I see sustainable care. And different generations, of course, will have a different understanding, perhaps, of what is sustainable care. I've had the privilege over the last year to have some time to look back on my mother's diaries. She started a diary in 1926 and wrote about care quite considerably during her life course. So it's very interesting kind of features there. So let me take also look through an academic lens, a research lens. And what I'd like to do is to take 2 time points here. One, 40 years ago, when I started as a social worker at Oxford, and then 10 years ago, when I wrote a book, Care, which has had quite a lot of attraction. And I think what I'd like to say about each of those books is how they looked at sustainable care. I think it's important to go back to classic studies, like ones that I studied with when I became a social worker, or was qualifying as a social worker, evaluating the effectiveness of social care for the elderly. Carers Perceived, Julia Twig's book. Policy is Personal by Care Ungerson. And the wonderful book, A Labour of Love by Janet Finch and Dulcie Groves. Very influential books 40 years ago, because there wasn't much written on older people. I think what was really interesting, I was looking at what was sustainable, and there's some very enduring themes in those books which have resonance today, very similar to today. So what's changed? I think it does raise the question of how can research readily influence and impact on policy and practice. They're sustainable themes, but we've still got the same problems. And I think it's important to go back and reflect on them and the research done in them to avoid duplication, to avoid reinventing the wheel in our research on care. But I think we need to look at some of the same themes as well, with fresh thinking and methods, using AI possibilities for data integration and the use of secondary and longitudinal data, and even going back to the data they used then, and applying them to the themes and problems today. So what were the themes of sustainable care 40 years ago? And I've taken this book in particular, which was a real classic study, to try and answer that particular question. And I think one of the things that's very interesting here, if you look at the chapters, they talk about residential care. They talk about sheltered lodgings, assisted lodgings and sheltered housing, daycare, voluntary care, as the bedrock of sustainable social care. And I think that's really interesting. Taking the first of those, residential care, we as academics actually did a terrifically bad service to residential care in the 1960s. We rubbished it. And we tried to regain its status in the 80s with another classic book, Residential Care, Positive Choice. But we really did a disservice to residential care. Yet research today shows that there's a real need for residential care as a valued part of sustainability of care. It has to be appropriate care, of course. And I think we need to change the narrative, particularly with the public, around residential care. And we need to do that through our research. Of course, it's been a really difficult year to do this, as the year has actually exposed the lack of understanding, particularly amongst politicians, about the role of residential care and its importance. But at the other end of the care spectrum as well, the role of housing, of transport, absolutely integral for sustainability of care. We're not actually addressing research at either end of those very much. And I think there's a real need for a refresh to really look at residential care and to really look at some of those preventative services. Okay, so going from 40 years ago then to 10 years ago when I wrote this book on care, what were the key conceptual developments that were actually framing sustainable care then? And I argued in the book for an ecological approach to reconceptualize care in order for it to be sustainable. And I went back and had a look at why I thought it was unsustainable. What were the key ingredients of unsustainable care? And came up with quite a few things which actually are still there today. The demographics and the demand for care, the weakening supply of care, both familial care and the supply of a trained workforce, recruitment and retention difficulties, the physical distance in the provision of care being an issue. Little did we know what Brexit would be throwing at us, and the wider ramifications of transnational care. And I think we've learned over the last year the importance of geography, whether it's in person or in terms of digital care, really important geographically. Policy solutions then were not attractive. We were really into short-termism and a lack of investment. Yet we can see care really being sustained through family, through care workers and their dedication. And we see it provided across continents. So coming to the present day, what do we see as sustainable now? What are the new areas that we've been addressing in the conference? And it's great to see an emphasis on technology as a key and new enabler, but the fact of it is it's an enabler of sustainable care. Digital kinning, the changed workforce and care markets, new areas that really need exploring. So thirdly, let me turn to a practice lens. Themes over the last 40 years have revolved around relationships, whether enduring or ambivalent relationships. All relationships will have an impact on our understanding of sustainable care. And to me, relationship-based care is at the heart of sustainable care. It's about interdependency, not just about people either, but also about systems. And I think this last year, again, has brought that home to us. So relationships are really important for sustainability. And finally, then, if we look through or reflect back through a policy lens, what is sustainable? Well, I've got a few points here which I'll throw out for discussion. Reflecting back on the 40 years, sustainability was very much around continuity of care. I remember learning it goes from informal to formal, at home to residential care, and you move along a continuum. Very naively, of course, research has shown that it's not so linear and much more complex than that. Yet somehow policy hasn't really caught up. Keeping people at home for as long as possible is still enshrined in legislation. Aging in place has taken off, but I think we really need to challenge these concepts if we're going to think about sustainability. We also know that there's a policy lag between research and its impact on policy. But what we've seen in the last year is rapid response and translation to policy, to research into policy. There's good examples around now of how to socially innovate, not necessarily in relation to the pandemic, but all sorts of areas. But it's that rapid translation we need to bring into social care. And we can learn lots of lessons here on how to do this. We need research too to inspire positive policy developments, not just rubbishing things like residential care, but really showing the positives, knowing the agenda of stakeholders, and looking towards more mission-orientated solutions. I'm a great fan of mission-orientated research. So I'd like to throw out a couple of challenges, perhaps we'll come back to them in discussion. Where does the concept and practice of sustainability of care, developed through the conference and a lot through the Circle research, find voice in the current government mantra of Plan for Growth, which focuses on levelling up, global Britain and climate change? And how do we engage in a more positive narrative around care to raise it on that political spectrum? Is there more traction with placing it with climate change, talking about green social care? After what we've gone through this year, I would hate to think that social care as a policy issue goes back in its box because our politicians find it too difficult to cope with. In conclusion then, I think we need to reflect through very different lens on what sustainable care is, to make sense of what sustainable care means to different stakeholders. I've just focused here on researchers, practitioners and policymakers, but it's not a fixed concept, but one that can be really attractive to everyone, including the public, if it's framed in a meaningful way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Judith. That's really thought-provoking, and I'm going to remind everyone that we want them to start putting their comments and thoughts into the chat. We're not going to take questions at this point, but your point about whether the UK's plan for growth is an opportunity for gaining some purchase on critical issues regarding the things we need to develop and change in care is really well taken. And thank you for that reflection back on the origins of 4 decades ago. Some of those books are sitting looking at me on my bookcase as I speak to you. So yeah, they're very important contributions, which I hope younger scholars are also taking a look at, because there's some great stuff there. And certainly Claire Ungerson, who I work with closely, was a brilliant scholar whose work we miss. So so thank you very much, Judith. I'm now going to give the floor to Professor Mary Daly, who's going to speak to us from the perspective of a warden. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue, for the introduction and also for the invitation. And hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of this and especially to think about sustainability. I really congratulate the Circle Centre for really engaging with this issue. So I've been given the task of talking about a warning. So mine is a bit, in a way, the more bleak presentation. And I thought that I would organize it in terms of really 4 risks that I see. So if we don't better address the sustainability of care, I think there are 4 main risks. And I'll talk about them within, I hope, 10 minutes as asked for. And the first is living in a continual crisis. Now, the word crisis is overused, but actually it's difficult to find other terms to describe the situation of care, social care in particular, because social care is, I think, not just in crisis, it's almost like a crisis phenomenon. And what do I mean when I say that? First, there is the duration aspect. Social care has been in crisis for at least 10 years. It didn't start with the pandemic, and it could have been could be argued to have been growing for the last 2 decades or even further back. So there's this long-term duration to crisis in social care. And then there's also a breadth to it, because we had austerity, which bequeathed us a funding crisis, which in turn leaked out, I think, to what we might call a humanitarian crisis. Perhaps that's too alarmist a language, but what I'm referring to is people not getting the care they need. We know that there's between 6 and 7, every 6 and 7 older people in the UK are not getting the care they need, and the proportion of adults receiving care is going down. We also have a crisis of public confidence, a political crisis. Policy making seems frozen, and policymakers don't seem to have any new ideas. Bottom line, it's not clear who's in charge. Now, I agree with Judith particularly about changing the narrative, even though there are some advantage, I suppose, to being in a kind of having a discourse of crisis, and that it might propel change and innovation. But I think crisis is ultimately disabling, and particularly if it endures over time. So all of this suggests to me the need to change the narrative. And I haven't thought this through fully, but I wonder if we could somehow fix it in the public and policy minds that social care could actually be a problem solver rather than a problem creator or generator, which is usually seen, that it might get us beyond the current paralysis. Now, I know there's a potential risk in instrumentalizing care, and we need to be really careful about that. But a problem-solving approach might help in several ways. It could, for example, or we could, for example, suggest social care as a source of employment for people, particularly young people, when there are going to be far fewer jobs. We could perhaps see it in terms, and I'm not talking about paid care here, but informal or unpaid care, as a focus of a participation income, a first step towards a universal basic income, for example. We could also represent care as a way of addressing or better addressing inequalities, whether on gender, racial, generational, or other lines, and equally as a step towards a better life for all, a better society, one that cares. So all of this would, of course, require greater public investment. But so what? A positive vision always requires resources, and it may be that we will find political and ideological space in pandemic times for changes that were unthinkable in normal times heretofore. The second risk that I want to talk about is about continued dependence on private, mainly market provision. In this country, social care particularly is privatized to a very high degree. And there are different elements to this. We know them well. One thing is that the funding crisis referred to in my first point has meant that we all have to take greater responsibility for social care, whether in terms of its informal provision in our own lives or in the sense of committing personal or familial funding to it. But privatization means much more than individual responsibility in this country. It actually means marketization. And this country, and especially England, has a very high degree of marketized provision. The statistics you probably know already, that only 3%, for example, of care homes in the public sector are in the public sector in England. While many other countries are outsourcing and marketizing their social care, this is not to the same degree as the UK, where effectively marketization is the main driver in the system. In fact, it is the market that's in charge. We have turned to capitalism for the fix. As part of this, there is a financialization of care underway. And this big term can be really brought down to a number of movements, like the movement of companies, big companies, into care provision, and also the movement of private equity companies, hedge funds, international real estate investors, treating the sector as one of potential profits and of new and the creation of financial products and services. And this is very much a hidden market. We know almost nothing about the behind the scenes operation of these companies and the degree to which companies and investors are involved and how they are carving up social care as a market, creating sub-companies to which they divert profits and dividends. There are a myriad of risks involved in this. One is, of course, dependence on private providers, for example, and the lack of any kind of, or a lack of significant democratic control of these providers. Social care becomes a product. People have few rights in this kind of system, and they certainly don't have social rights. So, and quality is another another problem, because quality is, the trend on quality is downward direction, with the money sucked out of the system, either by companies trying to service their debts through interest and other repayments, or through the dividends they pay to shareholders. And my warning here to conclude this section is that it's not just a crisis of public funding. It may be that the model itself may be actually wrong. And I don't know if any of you have seen Emma Dowling's new book, The Care Crisis, but she draws this out particularly well, I think. A third risk, I think, is around depletion of scarce resources. As Judith says, care is actually lodged in an ecosystem, but it's actually very resource heavy, so much so that we've had to develop ever more fine-grained definitions of it. So what are the resources we're talking about when we speak of resourcing care in a sustainable way? Well, one is labor, that's the most obvious one. Time is another one. Money, infrastructure, whether physical infrastructure or social infrastructure, such as networks of support, and also, of course, emotional commitment and emotional investment. So when we think about sustainability, we have to ask how much of these different resources are available in any particular situation, and is the balance right? And I think when we look across formal, informal care, the answers really are clear. There are too few resources available, and no, we don't have the balance right. And this became ever more visible during the pandemic, because what we saw, that the main care providing actors have been paid carers on the one hand and a host of informal carers on the other. And these have been more or less left to on their own as everything shut down or moved indoors. And I think the idea of interior or interiorization of care is very important, because it leads to, first of all, lack of visibility, but also potential or actual exploitation of those who are left to care more or less on their own, who are already probably in conditions living or working in poor conditions. And the risk, I think, is if we don't attend to sustainability, is of depletion of these scarce resources. And I'm not sure if any of you know the work of Shirin Rai, political scientist at the University of Warwick, and Catherine Hoskins, but they've done really interesting work about depletion as a concept, especially when it comes to social reproduction. And so to conclude this third risk, I think we have to think very broadly about resources needed, and also the need for actually a balanced set of resources. Fourthly, and almost finally, I think the fourth risk is that if we don't attend to sustainability, social care grows as a site and as a source of inequality and unfairness. The structure and funding of the social care system generate wide-ranging inequalities, including inequalities among regions and localities, between rural and urban areas, between genders, between income groups, between health conditions, and between carers of various types. And with care becoming more and more privatized and marketized, access to care and to caregiving becomes more and more dependent on what you can pay and where you live and what private or other resources you have available. So I think we need to see inequalities. There's quite a lot of interesting work now on care poverty, but it seems to me it's actually care as a vector of stratification, as a site of stratification, needs to be factored into the debate, because inequality is an anathema to sustainability. You can't muster change at a societal level if care is a very vested, evokes a very vested set of interests. It needs to evoke a universal set of interests. So finally, just there are the four things that I think I want to draw attention to: perpetual crisis, Groundhog Day. The second one was, forgetting it there, dependence on private resources. Thirdly, depletion. And fourthly, inequality. And I just want to end by saying that my perspective on thinking about care is probably shared by many of you. Yes, care is about meeting the needs of people in everyday life, with young children and frail, ill, or disabled adults to the fore, but it's much wider phenomenon than this. I see it as an arterial concept, connecting every sphere of life with social care in particular as a way of seeing the solutions to much of what is wrong with society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. So again, really significant food for thought there, I think. Mary's warnings about the sustainability of care, focusing on the continual crisis, the way we have shifted so dramatically, I think, over the last 25, slightly more years towards private provision and the implications of that, the depletion of scarce resources, which we really need to be looking after better and trying to develop, and that critical issue which you came to at the end, which we've been talking about quite a lot within the Sustainable Care Programme, particularly recently, Mary, about inequality and the different aspects of stratification in our societies where care plays out in ways which are really quite frighteningly damaging to some people, and there's gross unfairness evident to many of us in the studies that we're conducting. So thank you so much for your contribution, and I'll ask the audience again to think about what they want to ask and comment upon. I'll now turn to our third speaker, Karla Zimpel-Leal, and I invite you, Karla, to take the floor.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you for having me, for inviting me for this closing panel. With this formidable panel is amazing. So I've been asked to talk about a vision for sustainable care. And some of my points, as you're going to see, reflect back to what Meredith and Judith just said as well. So my vision for sustainable care is quite simple. It's a world where caring is pervasive and uplifting. Pervasive in the sense that it's ingrained and part of our society, and uplifting in the sense that it's something that we are all proud of doing and being part of. And I think one way we can do this, we can achieve this, is through innovation and community. So you could say that innovation is one very important aspect for sustainable care. We already have a pretty inclusive definition of what innovation is, something new and useful. It can be a product or a service, a process, or even a way of organizing. It can be something incremental or radical. But innovation is no solo genius. It's collective genius, and so is caring. Any innovation process includes diversity and conflict, trial and error, reflection and adjustment. It's about running a series of experiments, not a series of pilots. And experiments are about learning. Even when you get a negative outcome, you still learn something that you need to know. But pilots are more about being right. And when you don't work, someone or something is to blame. And as you know, in care, we suffer from pilotitis. And I think we lack the involvement with experiments. To illustrate this, I'd like to tell you a story about innovation and community. It's about this wonderful woman called Rebecca Hoskins. Rebecca grew up in the English countryside in a small town in Devon. She loved nature, she loved photography, and she went to university to study film and photography, and she became the first woman to win a bursary to the BBC Natural History Unit. And she was shooting films about the environment and ecology all over the world. It was really a dream job. All the traveling, shooting at different locations from Tasmania to Costa Rica. But with time, she started to become quite cynical and disillusioned about the waste and the littering in the environment that was all around her, always just neatly out of shot of her films. So she started to wonder, how can she change this way of being complicit? She convinced her boss to make a film about Hawaii. And he thought it would be about sunsets and beautiful beaches and different animals. But actually, every single shot was about the rubbish in the ocean. So it was a 15-month film project across the islands of Hawaii. And she created the first British documentary that exposed the marine plastic pollution. And she was convinced that when people saw what she saw, when they saw this devastation, people would change their behaviors and their habits. So the film was released. Hundreds of thousands of people watched it, but nothing happened. So she came back to England, quite disillusioned and not understanding why people wouldn't be affected by that the way she was. Does that sound familiar in care? But anyway, she thought, if I can't change the world, maybe I can do something small in my local community. Maybe I could see some change there. So she came back in her local village. She tried to persuade people to stop using plastic shopping bags. She went from shopkeeper to shopkeeper selling this idea. Most of them agreed that it was a good idea, apart from the butcher, which was not convinced about, was concerned about the meat juices, but she offered an alternative for that. She did a film night at the village art gallery, showing her documentary from Hawaii. And at the end of the film, everyone agreed to go plastic bag free. Then she convinced the bigger retailers, who agreed to sponsor cloth bags for every single person in the village. The night before the changeover, she and her allies from that community went from door to door, handling cloth bags on people's door handles. And the cloth bag will say, "Today, Modbury goes plastic free." So she didn't really have high hopes with that experiment. But she thought maybe even if a few people change their habits, that will be worth it. The next day, camera crews from all over the world turned to Modbury, from France, Germany, the BBC, and even China. The Chinese crew that came brought with them a cloth bag, and in it said in Chinese, "Our province follows Modbury." So she said, "Wow, that's great. How many people are in your province?" 32 million, they said. And that was the year that the world started to give up plastic shopping bags. So why did one experiment work and the other one didn't? Well, the first experiment she did was by herself. She had a clear vision. It was big, completely rational, with a very strong case and bound to succeed. But it failed. I think it's important to remember that we are dealing with society, and how we behave as individuals is very different from how we behave collectively. The second experiment was small, uncertain, involved some allies, but our social problems require social processes, which means convening and building relationships between people. In this case, she had the resources in the form of human relationships in her village, where everyone knew her and they trusted her. But she also addressed the problem by treating everyone as equal, and she offered a solution, or a beginning of a solution, in the form of the cloth bag. And that brought people together, that first changed their behavior, and then the village, within the village, and then spread nationally, as we have nowadays. So that's how I see the future for sustainable care, not as a solo act. It will take all of us to work together and change that behavior. I think even our responsibility as academics is to provoke or even initiate some of these experiments, as we already do. We've seen a lot of examples in the conference. And talking about the narratives that Mary and Judith discussed, I would go even further and challenge if care is the best word to use to change this shame and burden discourse that is associated with care to a more uplifting and responsible discourse. Perhaps coaching or something similar might be a better word than care to restore this sense of meaning. I think we need to reflect if the current system takes it away the sense of meaning by being a recipient of care rather than a participant of care. Because participation is enjoyable, is meaningful, creative, social. Of course, we need the social infrastructure, the workforce, the potential in people to be recognized, to concentrate on what people can do rather than what they can't do. I think if we look for guarantees, it's not going to get us many solutions. I think we need experiments, we need community, and we need innovation. And like Rebecca, she had the passion, but she also understood the need. She offered a tangible alternative, and she had the resources, mainly in the form of human relationships, and treated everyone as equal. Because the only way, I think, to protect anyone is to protect everyone. And that is my vision for sustainable care. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karla. Thank you for making us reflect and think, and for sharing a really memorable example that I think will really resonate with many of us. I like the way you've shared that with us, and I definitely think that the idea of focusing on participatory care and enabling care, and care that is something that everyone is proud of,
yes,
instead of ashamed of. This is something I've said myself in the past, that, you know, we're in a situation where we've got a care system we're ashamed of, and actually we could produce a care system that we're all proud of, and wouldn't that be brilliant? So yes. Thank you for sharing that optimistic vision, and also an example of how it could perhaps get going, and that's really helpful. So what I'm going to ask people now is to ask all the panelists to come back into the frame so that we can comment together. And we have got some comments and questions, so I'm going to start by picking up the first of those, which came from Mary Larkin, who is at the Open University. And Mary worked with me to develop and with others to develop the International Journal of Care and Caring, and was a founding member of the editorial team for it. So welcome, Mary. And Mary says that she likes Mary Daly's idea about developing a discourse around social care being a problem solver. What are the key stages in the development of such a discourse? So would you like to respond to that, Mary? And then perhaps Judith or Karla may also have a comment in relation to that question.
Well, Sue, I don't know if I can answer that question, really. I mean, it's a big question. I've just been thinking about this. When I look at all the work on social care, I think so much of it is about the problems. And I've just been trying to think myself about even concepts that actually are about solving it. And, you know, the care economy is a kind of a problem-solving concept, even though it raises issues of its own. It depends on whose caring economy really we're talking about. So I'm not sure I can think about it. You know, I wonder if it's something like mainstreaming care or something like that, you know. And of course, doesn't answer Mary Larkin's thing, because Mary says, what are the stages, or what are the key stages of it? So I don't know whether we should be thinking of actual practical policies that we would then represent in particular ways, or whether it's much broader than that, actually, that we need to change the vision. They're the kinds of things I'm thinking about, but I'd like the others and the audience indeed to think about it.
Judith, do you have a comment? You need to unmute. I think we can't hear you. You probably have to request to come back in, Judith, I think. Okay, Karla, do you want to?
It's okay.
Okay, you're there, Judith. Okay, off you go.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much. Great question. If I can answer this through a research lens, I think maybe quite useful. I hope useful. I think what is the problem to start with? If we're going to look at it as a problem solver, then what is the problem? And I think we've got huge evidence. You know, we've got a litany of problems that we need to address, and I think we need to break them down to start with. And this is where I think mission-orientated research can really come in, because mission-orientated research is problem-solving research. So as researchers, we've got the problem, and then you look at how you actually, you know, kind of solve the problem, rather than coming in at it from a very disciplinary perspective. So this comes back to the ecological approach of care as well. It's got to be interdisciplinary, it's got to be intersectoral, but you all weighed in on that particular problem or mission. And, I think this has been very well expressed by Mariana Mutsakarta, who it will probably be known to many of you, who's an economist, actually. And she's not really addressing it in social care, but in other areas. But there's a lot of lessons that we can bring across. So I think the first thing is for researchers to define the problem, to specify the problem, and then to take a mission-orientated approach to their research. And look at that under the lens. So very interdisciplinary, and of course co-produced, the problem co-produced, co-defined with key stakeholders, and particularly people who are receiving care, giving care. And I think it's that way in which we can really then reshape that narrative as well.
Yes.
Thank you, Judith. Karla, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. I completely agree with what Judith says, actually. And that's one of the, when I was thinking about how can I talk about a vision for care, because I try to imagine what's the ideal scenario, because if I think about all the problems would be too difficult to, so I think we have to, as she said, see which different parts we need to look at differently, because to look as a whole is just too big. That's why I suggest experimentation is probably a good way that allows us to, to pursue one or more opportunities to discover which has the more potential for different crises, if you like. And the financial exposure for experiments can be quite small. So the community example, I think, is quite good. So yes, I totally agree with, we saw a lot of examples, I think, recently with the crisis, the mutual aid networks that formed and that sort of thing. And I think us as academics, we should look at that as well and support those organizations. A lot of us work with organizations. I think a lot of the work can be done from communities and from organizations rather than wait for reforms and policies to come in place. I think it can go the other way around as well.
Thank you, Karla. And I would add there that I think if we think about the age-friendly cities development, which has grown and is influential, but is not a national policy initiative, it's something where people living in parts of countries can bring a focus on an issue and try to make progress in incremental steps. That seems a possible way forward, and I think we are seeing some attempts in the UK, and I know there are other parts of the world where these are happening too, where care is being approached in that way, and we need to think about how national systems and policies mesh with community and local initiatives. The other example I would give would be the awareness of dementia experiments that have been developed in various parts of the world, and the attempt to kind of use an educational focus to help people to become aware that dementia isn't something to be frightened of or ashamed of or to hide, but it's something we need to embrace, because it's going to be a common disease that every society is going to encounter, and we need to think of ways of making our communities dementia friendly. And I think whilst there are limitations to that approach, but nevertheless, I think there has been some really excellent and inspiring work done in Japan and other places around that. So that would be my other example. Majella Kilkee raises a different point, but is picking up also on Mary's argument about changing the discourse on social care to one of problem solver. And she says this, to her mind, chimes with a call to change the discourse on migration as a problem, to highlight how migrants contribute to systemic resilience by supplying labour to essential sectors, including care. And I just wonder what your reflections were on the whole complicated debate about what we might do internationally, because whilst I like Karla's idea of going local and building from there, a bit of me also feels we need some international cooperation on some of these big issues, and we maybe need to, take some big steps like were taken by, agreeing internationally that, we would make an international declaration of human rights, or we would have, international standards about education, the right to education, and international standards about how we treat disabled people. And I just think, is there something international as well that we might want to do? But maybe perhaps reflect on Majella's comment about migration and think about the role of moving across borders in making care sustainable, both positive and negative aspects of that, I think. Anyone like to kick off on that? Judith, we need you to use your volume again.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Apologies. I think by now, after a whole year of you're on mute, I'd really kind of get it. But anyway, sorry about that. If I'll have a go at a stab at a little bit of that anyway. I do think this is the way to go. And I think the reason I was introducing Plan for Growth also in terms of, climate change and what can we learn from the climate change activists. I think looking at other sectors, seeing what people have done, and having these international declarations and so forth is really critical. And really it's chipping away over years. It's not a quick fix really. But I think we do need real champions who will, political champions as well, who will take this forward. And I think also in the thrust about global Britain, we've really got to get a handle, on that and get social care in that debate on global Britain that's going on at the moment. I mean, if I be candid, then, we don't look like global Britain at the moment, but social care really can highlight the importance of that. I think some really good case studies may be important here. But again, I think perhaps looking at some of the successful debates in the political arena are really, really important. As you said, so copying others that have really done this in a different way.
Thanks. Karla, do you have any comments on the issues relating to migration and transnationality and borders and the experience of living in a society which is different from the one that where your roots are?
Oh yes, I think it's extremely important. As you know, I love to bring cases and best case scenarios and things like that. But I think it's only viable if we have a leadership that accepts those changes. If not, it's kind of, just stays within research, but it never actually gets implemented. I think unless we have a government that accepts that, it will make a change. Otherwise, we're just going to have the examples. That's my view anyway.
Okay, Mary?
I wondered about the ILO and the Convention on Decent Work in that regard. And of course, paid care is terribly, and nothing about that, as far as I'm aware, has improved over the course of the pandemic. If anything, it's worsened. We've expected more of them and we haven't really rewarded them. So I wondered about the conditions of work, if that would be something that would improve, that we could sign up to. When I say we, I'm not sure this government, but you know what I mean, that we could have as an aspiration to bring about change. And that's my fear, I think. I mentioned the interiorization of stuff, and it's just really come to me very strongly over the course of the pandemic that this movement into the private is very dangerous, really, in some ways, because there's no observation, there's no regulation. And that really worries me. But what I like in Majella's comment is about the contribution, and that I think was part of what I was trying to say when I say about treating social care or care as a helping to solve problems. So the contributions it makes rather than the problems it creates. So in some ways it's about, and Karla also mentioned, the representation of it. What do people believe about it? How does the public see it? And the fear is that the public sees it in very bad terms. And I'm not sure that the pandemic has changed that, actually. I think there was a light bulb moment when people said, oh, there are all these people caring, and, our older people in homes or wherever, and they're so, so dependent on people who care. But that was kind of looks like it was quickly forgotten. So I think it's to get the public imagination is what I'm really trying to get at, and not at all saying that Judith's contribution around thinking of the problem and so forth, what's the problem, being clear about the problem. To me, part of the problem is that there's no confidence. There's no, that care doesn't have a grip on the public, or a positive grip on the public, in the same way that the NHS does, for example. And if it doesn't have a grip on the public, it won't have a grip on politicians, I think.
Thanks, Mary. And that brings to mind the way you picked up contribution there, brings to mind the work that has inspired part of our current research program, which is the work done by Janet Fast at the University of Alberta in Canada. And Janet had a project which was about the costs and contributions of care, and she really focused on thinking about, well, who is contributing to this, and who is paying costs, and the debate in England in particular is very narrow around the cost of care, and preparing for the public cost of care, and how we're going to manage the cost of care, but very, very poor. And we've got very poor data actually on, that enables us to quantify who and which people in society, whether individuals or organisations, are contributing. And I think that it's really important that we articulate that more clearly. And it's one of the things we have tried to do in the Sustainable Care Programme. We've got a work package which is focused on that topic, and we've tried to think particularly about what unpaid carers contribute, which of course also sometimes involves them personally making costs. The cost and contribution thing can be seen as the two sides of one coin. But I think that's an important development. And of course, Janet's work also comes from a department of human ecology. So, it's an ecological way looking at the world and thinking about its sustainability. And I think this is something we really need to focus on. Too often, I think we're encouraged to think about care as the other side of the coin with health. Whereas actually, I think we need to think about care as fundamental and actually prior to health, as well as something which needs to follow health interventions. We tend to think about lots more care needed because people are coming out of hospital and needing more care, but actually care precedes those interventions as well. And it's the health interventions in a way which kind of are the irregularities, and the care are the continuities. And I think if we could get people to think more about their everyday lives and the way care is part of that, we would have a platform on which we could persuade the public that care is really important. I think when it actually comes to it, when they actually face it, almost everyone thinks care is important, but it's not an important issue in the way that defence or even housing or some other issues are seen as important issues. So I think that's another issue to consider. We've got a comment from Teppo. He says, care as an arterial concept, in impeccable English spelling, I would like to say, from Teppo Kroger, who leads the Centre of Excellence in Aged Care in Finland. And he says, sounds a very interesting concept. Can you say a bit more about your thoughts on that, Mary? So can we ask you to say a bit more about what that might mean, particularly bearing in mind some of our audience are not native English speakers?
Yeah, thank you, Tippo, and hello. I think, Judith, you might need to turn off your microphone. Thank you. Sorry about that. There's an echo. Yeah, I was thinking of it, almost in a physical landscape sense of river underneath ground and water and so forth. And I'm not thinking of it in any particular complex way and in any unique way to me, I think, because I think we all think of care as running throughout everyday life, as being everywhere, actually. But I was thinking about it in terms of, it's being hugely important, not just in terms of physical well-being and mental well-being and so forth, but much more broadly in terms of the resources that are exchanged in society, and also in terms of the relationships on which these resources are based. So it is just another way, Teppo, of saying that, in a way, the universality of care, really. I came across it, I'd written it in an old article that I hadn't looked at for years, and I thought, oh, that's nice. I'll think more about that. So that's for the future. But I think it reflects the way many of us are thinking, really.
Thanks, Mary. Judith or Karla, do you want to comment on that point, or shall I pick up another one? Judith?
Well, only to say, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, it's fundamental to everything. And I think just related back to your previous point about prevention and, looking at care across the life course, because we experience it in different forms across the life course. It can be part of the discourse around housing, transport, everything of life, really. And I think it's making sure we embed it as a kind of, as blood flows through the whole system, as Mary's kind of described, or water flowing through the system, that we actually embed social care and align it with agendas in every part of our life course. I think that's crucial.
Thanks, Judith. One of the things I've found encouraging recently has been taking a look, which I did just before Christmas, at some of the latest developments in European policy. And whilst there's an element of that which makes me sad, because I was not in favour of leaving the European Union, as probably many of you will know. But it seems to me that the social pillar of rights approach, which is being developed by the European Commission, and in particular the agenda that seems to be developing that around gender equality and long-term care and good work practices, seem to me to be, and trying to establish some standards, if you like, as kind of a minimum floor in that area is something really encouraging. And if European member states can genuinely deliver on that and can cooperate across their vast differences in relation to the way they organise care in different parts of the European Union, to actually make progress on that, I think it will be an inspiration to the world. And it certainly seems to me that this is something really to watch, because they've set out some quite challenging ambitions, and there's more to come, I think, in terms of policy guidance. And in particular, I really like what at first I didn't at all understand, because I found the terminology off-putting, which was the coordination approach to the method of coordination as a way of thinking about making progress. But actually it's about learning from each other, and this is what we've been doing in this conference, and this is what I found really inspiring about the very multinational set of papers that we've drawn. There are fascinating things happening in different countries that we can learn from. Mary?
Yeah, I just wanted to endorse what you said about the European Union. I think it is interesting what's happening in the EU and the way it's turning to old age care in particular. I mean, the EU has been very interested in childcare for quite a long time, but it hasn't particularly been interested in old age care. But it now is, and things like, as well as the pillar of social rights, or as part of the pillar of social rights, of course, they want to give leave for care for older people or care for family members other than children. And that's a real step forward, I think, because part of what we're saying all the time is about the recognition of care, really. And this recognizes care. It may not be sufficient. It's only a number of days a year, I think, as the suggestion at present, but it's putting this hugely vital sphere of engagement on in the policy portfolio and on the policy platform. And I think it's very important in that regard. So yeah, the EU is interesting.
So you're on mute.
Sorry, I was worried about echo. Diane Burns has asked us, has commented that Judith pointed out that monographs on social care from across the decades describe different landscapes, but that similar problems remain. She says, is research aimed at ultimately changing social policy and social care policy in particular powerful enough? We seem to do more and more of it, but relatively little changes. And she says, it seems that the government in England and other countries will take action when money can be made. Anyone want to pick up that?
I'll have a go. Well, I think that there's a lot of research, and it depends where it falls. It's a bit like the sower of seeds, isn't it? You know, if it falls on stony ground, which we seem to be in and have been for many years, then the message isn't taken up. And if the ground isn't fertile enough or hasn't got the resource, then it won't flourish. I do think there's opportunities now. I mean, just to plug the new Impact Centre, which Sue and John Glasby are heading up, which is looking at evidence and implementation. And I think we probably haven't really looked at that implementation, that translational piece enough, actually. And I think that the research is powerful, but the translation hasn't been powerful. And I think we need to work on that. So I'm optimistic about the new centre delivering on that. But as I said, it depends where the seeds fall. And of course, I must remind everyone, coming from Wales, living in Scotland, care is actually a devolved issue. So when we're talking about government, actually, they're different things.
Okay. Anyone else want to pick up on that point from Diane? We've got a couple of other comments as well. Okay, I'm going to pick up a related comment which picks up Diane's intervention. It says, it's from Catherine Needham at the University of Birmingham, and Catherine says, I was struck by Loretta Baldassar's comment, I think she means in Loretta's opening keynote speech, that things have got worse in the last 20 years. She was talking about a decline in multicultural provision in the Australian system, and she's saying it's not even that they're remaining the same. So we've got a little bit of pessimism and despair, possibly even creeping in. Anyone want to respond to that? Karla, with your optimistic vision, do you want to pick up on that?
Oh, I'm not so sure. I mean, if I can go back a little bit to Diane's point about the social policy, my view is a bit closer to Judith, I think, in terms of, I think as academics, perhaps we should focus more on being inventive and develop things with organizations, third sector, and work much more in the practical practice level of those things. I mean, I haven't been in the care sector for that long, but I feel that perhaps more can be done if we work directly with organizations rather than policy. And I'm very excited about the Impact Centre. So yeah, that's all I can say.
Thank you, Karla. Thank you. Mary?
Yeah, I just wondered in response to Catherine's comment, I didn't hear Loretta, whether COVID has changed things really. I'm struck by how much emphasis there is on inequality and how that has become so much part, not just of the public debate, but also of the research councils like, you know, UKRI. I mean, there's practically an inequality which has very strong racial and multicultural dimensions. I think there's practically an inequality dimension in almost every research funding call at the moment. And that could, I think that's an invitation to go public, I suppose, around multicultural problems, or whether they manifest themselves in care homes or in lack of provision or the monoculturality of provision and thinking. So there might be something there. COVID might change that.
Thanks, Mary. We've also got a comment which perhaps picks up on that from Rob Anderson. Rob Anderson, many of you will know, was for many years at the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions, and he's been the chair of the Sustainable Care Programmes Advisory Board since 2017. He's been great help to us, and he says is there anything promising in the current political moment, and I suspect he's meaning the COVID-19 pandemic, to take forward the public policy debate on reform of social care? Are there more politicians on message? And I feel sceptical about some of our most prominent politicians, and in particular, we've heard commitments from our Prime Minister, which it seems hard to believe that he's truly thought through and is serious about. But do we think there is an opportunity here now to pick up, maybe at local as well as national levels of politics, and maybe not just in the UK, but to pick up on people's greater awareness of the needs of older people, of the existence of residential care homes, of the work that care workers do, and of the issues that arise, particularly in later life?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is an opportunity for all the informal networks that were formed could be supported by more formal structures. I think that could go on. We seem to have organized a chaotic environment quite quickly, but I think that needs support from more formal structures to carry on. So I think there is an opportunity for that. In terms of the workforce, which is probably the biggest problem, I think, at the moment. I'm not entirely sure if I have any ideas about that. How can it sustain? Because I think it was short-lived. My experience.
Yeah, I can see why you think that's a risk, Karla. I also think, though, that we've now seen what can be mobilised when it has to be.
Yeah,
and I think that should be an inspiration to us. That sometimes we thought, well, you can't ask. Is that too big an ask, or is that too big a change to request? How on earth would they possibly do that? Well, we've got some quite recent evidence now that quite a lot can be done, and people will make quite a lot of sacrifices for the benefit of others. And maybe that's a moment to me that is perhaps quite inspirational. The voices against the acting to protect everyone have been quieter than the voices for it, and that seems to me to be optimistic. But
yes,
Judith, do you have a comment on Rob's point?
Yes. Well, I think this is where the devolved nations actually are a little probably ahead of England in some of this, because I think, if I can talk from a Scottish perspective, with the emphasis on well-being very much at the heart of government policy and everything driving things from a well-being perspective, bit like what happened in New Zealand, I think will actually orientate or pivot the debate and the support for social care, within that. So I do think there's opportunity for Westminster to really look out to the devolved administrations. Not perfect, of course. The integration of health and social care is still rhetoric in both Scotland and Wales. But, I think that there's a platform from the well-being perspective that actually could be quite helpful here, with politicians well behind it as well.
Okay. Does anyone have there's no other questions that I think open up a new angle, and we're coming towards the end of our time. So I'd just like to give each of you the opportunity to make a final comment for your fellow researchers, because many of the people on the call are going to be probably important in influencing forward research agendas on care. And I hope that the conference will have convinced them that there's real energy and intellectual enthusiasm for trying to work through these issues in the research community internationally at the moment. So anyone would like to give a short message to that particular audience while you have the chance? Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in first then.
Thanks, Judith.
Well, just coming back to the point about mission-orientated research, I think there's huge potential here in reframing the research questions of social care, and really crossing those disciplinary groups to be truly interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, and not looking at the usual suspects in the care mix of researchers either. Work with engineers, work with computer scientists. That's where the opportunities are. And I think that would bring transformational change and translation of research into policy and practice.
Thank you, Judith. Karla?
Yeah, so I think my main takeaway would be to, normalizing care as a proud and uplifting part of life, to promote perhaps these relational values and look for those in our research, so that we all as individuals can live fulfilled lives according to our own values. And I think for communities to work together to maintain independence, I think we need to invest in prevention. Prevention for me is the foremost thing. Everything else falls in place after that, I think. And where the state is needed, I think, is to support communities and to help people to retain and regain independence. I think we can transform care not only by looking upwards to the state, but outwards to open communities, to empower individuals to unlock their creativity of their neighborhoods and to deliver a care society. That's my view.
Thank you. And a final word from you, Mary?
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely with what Judith and Karla have said. I mean, my sense is about, I suppose I'm really thinking about the public image. And, it's clear, I think, from what I've said, that I feel that there is a problem in lack of confidence and lack of knowledge and lack of positivity or positive perception around the care system, particularly in this country, I think. And not so much in other countries, really, but this country particularly, I think. And so I feel as researchers, we need to kind of engage with that, both in the sense of the active research we do, but also in terms of how we promote the findings of our research or just our observations. And that's one of the good things I think about the pandemic is that blogs are much more popular. We don't have to write the 8,000 word article or the 100,000 word book or whatever. And even though these are important, but there's a way of reaching the public, I think, a more engaged way and an easier way for us than has been before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. And can I say a very sincere and heartfelt thanks to all three of you for great opening statements, really doing justice to the efforts that so many of those who've participated in the conference have put into making it a really, really thought-provoking and exciting conference. So certainly that's been my perspective. So thank you all very much indeed. I'm just now going to turn to make a few special few thanks before I make my own final comments as I formally close the conference. So I'd like to perhaps you could show the first slide, Xander, please, from the tech room. Thanks. I'd like to start by just waiting for that to come up. Thanks. I'd like to start by thanking the organising committee for the conference, and their names are there on the slide. But I'd like particularly to draw attention to the heroic efforts made by our close colleague and my main supporter in the endeavours that we've set upon with the Sustainable Care Programme, Dr. Kelly Davidge. Kelly has been fantastically energetic in thinking about the way we could organise the conference and then bring it to fruition. And she's worked very hard with a great technical team that we've recruited behind the scenes. So thanks very much to all of them as well. But major thanks to the organising committee who worked very hard to prepare the April 2020 version that never happened, and have that work, the good work that they did has really provided a lot of context for what's come since. I'd also like to thank Professor Nora Keating and those who worked with her to organise the Early Career Researcher Workshop, which I understand was a great success, and to thank the mentors for that workshop, who were Catherine Needham, Magella Kilkee, John Glasby, Gabrielle Marr and Kate O'Loughlin. And if you could move to the next slide, I'd equally like to thank the theme conveners. As you know, we had 7 themes plus an open theme, and I'd like to thank Magella and those who worked with her on inequalities in care. I'd like to thank Attractor and those who worked with her on work, care and wellbeing. I'd like to thank Matthew for leading on technology and care, and Gabrielle for leading on care markets. Hildegard in Germany led on sustainable care at home with Shireen, and caring relations was inspired very much by the work of our former colleague, Professor Alistair McGregor, who retired from the university last summer. And Karla, of course, with Fiona MacDonald at RMIT in Australia, helped to develop the care workforce wellbeing theme, and did some, for which attracted some interesting papers that I've enjoyed listening to. And I'd like to thank Agnes for supporting the development of the open theme. And if you could just show the final slide, I'm sure everyone would like to express our sincere thanks to our keynote speakers, to Loretta Baldassar, who spoke to us about digital kinning and transnational care, and to Joan Tronto, who urged us to end wealth care as a way of achieving caring democracy. We've had 4 panels organised by the conference organisers, a very inspiring wellbeing panel to which the contributors are listed on the slide, which was in honour of our late colleague, Dr. Annie Austin, who sadly died aged 39 last year, whose work continues to inspire us. And our policy panel, which was a great success, and I thought generated some really interesting discussion. All of those listed there, including our friends at Carers UK and at the Care Workers Charity and the King's Fund and at Eurocarers, gave a really excellent policy panel. And I'd like to thank Rob Anderson and Alison Scurfield and Madeline Starr, who contributed to the Power Of panel, which ran earlier this week. So I turn now to my own final remarks. So perhaps we don't need to keep the slide up now. Thank you. And I'd just like to say a few words as to conclude the conference. And I'd like to speak about what everyone involved in our online conference has achieved as we've brought the whole efforts, not just of the team that organised it, but of everyone who's contributed to fruition. First thing I'd like to say is that despite the conversation we've just had and a lot of concerns and anxieties that many of us have, we can see some ways forward, as well as that there are very serious risks and challenges as we consider how care could and should be arranged as the 21st century progresses. Care, to me, is about connections and human values. Care always has been and always will be needed, but it is each generation's and each country's and community's responsibility to find ways of enabling our fellow humans to flourish from birth to the end of life. Joan Tronto has helped us to think about this, and she's emphasised that we need to think about, to focus on what we care about and who we care about, and about caring for and caring for each other. She's reminded us that caregiving involves effort and commitment and skill, that caregiving is work, and that we must keep focused on the recipients of care and to be attentive to their needs and to ensuring that they are listened to and supported and involved in their care, leading to what she calls caring with each other. And she drew attention to this concept, particularly in the article that she wrote for the founding edition of the International Journal of Care and Caring. This is Joan's 5th phase of care, in which everyone can rely upon an ongoing cycle of care to continue to meet their caring needs. And I think it remains and will continue to be an inspiring vision for us all to think about. I also want to emphasise that care matters. And if we are to do better, it will require all our ingenuity and our continuous collaboration and our ongoing commitment to studying care and looking at how it works for whom, to building evidence about how care and the work of care is distributed and shared and can best be supported and organised. This conference has made me more confident. I'm an optimist, but I do feel that we can do better, much better than is currently being achieved. And if we are to get to sustainable arrangements for care, we must build them on cooperation within families and communities, between nations and across borders. And we must build them on evidence from lived experience, from what in the new Impact Centre we've decided to call practice wisdom, the knowledge and of those who work in and are expert on care, and from sound research, particularly but not exclusively social science research. We must identify and address vested interests and power imbalances, and I think Joan Tronto's talk really drew that to our attention in a very powerful way. And we must work together to eradicate exploitation, particularly in caring relations and in caring work. We may need new international standards and goals, and I feel sure that we need to identify key principles. We need to articulate these and to test them out with the public, and with policymakers and with people who need and provide care or support. So as social scientists and experts on care, I think we must try to find routes to better understanding of care. And I think we can feel confident that good quality comparative analysis of data, of policy and of practices, and that detailed and meticulous local studies that delve into the details of care practices and experiences, and that intercultural and interdisciplinary investigations around the world and in cooperation with international partners, as we've tried to achieve in the Sustainable Care Programme, will continue to be important. And critically, I think we need to know that analysis that explores global economic and political barriers to the development and good care will be crucial in the future. So in concluding, I would just like to stress that that I think we've had a really positive experience of this conference. There is much to inspire us in the recorded presentations, which I know many of you will have started to view and to think about. But I encourage you to listen to all of those which speak to your own areas of interest. And I'd like sincerely to thank every single person who's contributed an idea, a comment, to a conversation, participated in a Q&A session or in one of our Join the Debate sessions, or who's prepared a paper for their patience with the technology and with the preparations we've made for this, and to thank them for what I hope has been for them, as it has been for me, a really inspiring and significant experience in opening up our minds to some new ideas about care and helping us to clarify the work that we've been doing jointly and individually, some of us over many years, to try to ensure that we have a more sustainable caring future in which, as our colleague Annie Austin would wish us to do, we prioritise the importance of human well-being. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining this final closing panel, and I wish all of you the very best. And the Sustainable Care Programme continues until the end of September. We hope to have new research to pick up immediately after that, but we will be having a lot of output and contributions that we will make available through our website and other challenge in the months to come. So look out for that, and please continue to share your work with us. We value the collaboration and international cooperation that we have achieved through this conference and through the wider programme. Thank you.